There were no political arguments echoing through Caligula's royal hallways. They resounded with individuals pleading for forgiveness. Rome's aristocracy encountered a new kind of horror under his reign, a nightmare in which spouses were made to applaud as their wives were humiliated as if it were a bizarre theatrical production, and dads were forced to auction off the purity of their own daughters. This was not a case of random craziness. Cruelty was not an exception to this deliberate system. It was the way things were every day. All of it was recorded in official documents and reported as any ordinary cost incurred by the empire. Each nightmare had a protocol, an entry number, and a price tag. And as a result, the greatest empire in antiquity submitted to a system of coordinated depravity. We must go back to the time when a happy young man was heralded as Rome's greatest hope in order to comprehend how Rome came to that point. Make careful to support the growth of this little channel before delving farther into this decline. To ensure you never miss any of our darker historical studies, hit the like button and subscribe. Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, the cherished son of a well-liked Roman leader, was known to the world as Caligula due to the little army boots he wore as a youngster. His rise to prominence was seen as a miracle. For a whole 100 days, people rejoiced. He was seen by the masses as the heir apparent to a fabled dynasty. After Emperor Tiberius's oppressive paranoia, senators at last relaxed. Nobody could have predicted that this attractive, intelligent, and captivating young man would go on to become the architect of Rome's most organized system of moral corruption. He experienced both tragedy and luxury in his early years. The legions who worshipped his father nurtured him amid warriors who were held in high regard. However, he also saw the darker side of imperial politics, including the annihilation of his own family and the strange murder of Germanicus, which was probably caused by poison. Agrena the Elder, his mother, was banished. His elder brothers were either imprisoned or put to death. Caligula managed to live by portraying himself as harmless, stupid, and unthreatening. He learned a valuable lesson while growing up in Tiberius's palace. He became an expert at pretending since existence in Rome relied on deceit. Everything seemed hopeful when he initially ascended to the throne. Taxes were lowered. Political prisoners were freed. Magnificent public games were held. Infrastructure was enhanced. Aqueducts were constructed. Key highways were fixed. And the legions were rewarded. Rome loved him. Flowers were strewn in his route by women. Youngsters praised him with songs. Senators vied for his attention, the same men who would later shudder at the sound of his footfall. After years of being imprisoned under Tiberius's fear-based reign, it seemed as if Rome's golden era had finally come. Contrast was astounding. Caligula moved freely among the populace, participated in public festivities, and even ate meals with senators on Capri, while Tiberius sequestered himself. He seemed kind, giving, and quite heavenly in his popularity. The people really thought they had finally been given the perfect king by the gods. Then everything was different. He became unwell in the fall of 37 due to an unexplained disease. He was on the verge of death for weeks. Court physicians recorded delusional moments in which he claimed to be conversing with Jupiter directly, terrible spasms that needed several men to keep him still, and fevers higher than they believed a person could endure. Fear paralyzed Rome. Priests made many sacrifices to the gods. In order to save the emperor, several people pledged their own lives. And there was a fundamental difference in him when he eventually opened his eyes. The first indication was hardly imperceptible. He ordered the heads of all the gods in Rome to be replaced with his own. The change became unavoidable after that. It is said that a person's physique speaks louder than their words. After that sickness, Caligula's physique revealed a really unsettling tale. His pupils were abnormally wide, and his once lively, warm gaze became empty, predatory. He wandered the castle at night, chatting to sculptures, conversing with the moon, and reacting to foes he could not see due to his unrelenting sleeplessness. He was often discovered by servants in the royal grounds at morning, covered in dirt and nude. They said he had been sowing the seeds of Rome's future. However, the future was not what he planted. It served as the starting point for his decline into something much more sinister. It began in his own home with his sisters Agrena, the younger, Julia Livilla, and Drusilla. They were more than simply his family now. They were the first victims of a policy that would eventually become state policy. He had the most intense obsession with Drusilla. He referred to her as his Diana. At public gatherings, he seated her in areas designated exclusively for royal spouses, treating her like his empress. When Drusilla passed away in 38, Caligula became very angry. He imposed an official mourning time that was so rigid that family meals, washing, and even laughing were prohibited. Anyone who showed signs of joy was put to death. However, his sorrow wasn't love. It was the rage of someone who believed death itself had taken his property. Now that Drusilla was gone, he turned his focus to his surviving sisters and subsequently to the wives and daughters of Rome's aristocracy. The system really started at this point. Noble ladies were forced by Caligula to perform with senators. He watched from a specially constructed golden throne, noting who seemed eager, who hesitated, and who only made an effort to be courteous. Later on, these notes were used as political leverage. Suddenly, a senator who had shown Julia Livilla enthusiasm was unquestioningly endorsing every imperial edict. Another reluctant parent discovered his little kid taken, and a few days later returned to him permanently damaged and castrated as a warning. There was no mistaking the signal. Neutrality was non-existent in Caligula's Rome. Everyone has the potential to become a victim or an offender, often both. In a house close to Pompeii, Roman physician Lucius Scriber left behind notes that were concealed for years and described how Caligula had him check noble ladies and girls to determine their fertility and resilience to repeated usage. The emperor personally conducted these dehumanizing exams in front of the women, asking intrusive and demeaning questions about their bodies. This brutality was not impulsive. It was planned, bureaucratic, and carried out with the same accuracy as a census. Fees and rates were uniform. Caligula had created a system of governance out of personal depravity, a device intended to destroy opposition, demolish dignity, and transform Rome's nobles into submissive tools of his authority. A knight with a senator's wife had 16 terzios, 2,000 for his daughter, a virgin, 5,000 if he won both. Immediately, the money did not vanish into personal coffers. Under the guise of voluntary donations for the benefit of the state, they were thrown directly into the imperial treasury. Caligula insisted on referring to the palace as a temple of divine worship. He really meant it. This was not a symbolic rebranding. He made rituals, hallways, and rooms work like a sacramental machine. Every room had a name and a purpose. The emperor cast himself as a living god and dispensed his favors in the chamber of Jupiter, which was utilized for his ritualized atrocities. There was the chamber of Venus, which was used for forced rituals in which noble women were made to reenact episodes from myth. Even the emperor's chosen subjects were subjected to humiliation in a chamber connected to Priapus. Caligula commissioned elaborate frescoes to adorn these areas. The noises in the Travertine halls, which had previously been used for discussions about law and war, had completely changed, and the senators, the men who had constructed Rome, were forced to pass through those same hallways in order to hear what transpired and keep quiet. The mechanism was unbelievably complex. The spouses of senators who were conscripted into what the emperor referred to as the imperial cult were at the top of the hierarchy. They conducted ceremonies in accordance with rigid timelines, donned clothes that were assigned to them, and wore translucent Syrian silks that were almost ceremonial. Daughters came next. Under the guise of heavenly teaching, girls as young as 12 were gradually introduced to the regimen. Caligula, however, was not content with humiliation. What amounted to a selective breeding effort is described in a series of confidential documents. The most fertile women were forced to have children who would grow up as imperial dependents. From infancy, Children are isolated from their dads and groomed to fulfill court requirements. The ledgers recorded every conception, birth, and neonatal death. Scribes noted a terrible statistic. Many pregnancies terminated in frantic efforts to avoid delivery. And men were not immune. Caligula gave the order to feminize the boys of aristocratic families by clothing them in flowing saffron tunics, painting in white lead and vermilion on their faces, and instructing them to gesture and move in ways that pleased him. At banquets, these youngsters were paraded and put up for sale that evening. Seldom was the emperor's engagement motivated by desire. Domination was at issue. Every public transgression and behavior was a purposeful political message. Nothing is holy that I can't taint. No custom is impervious to my influence. No family is impervious to disintegration. His recruitment of families for their own destruction was perhaps his most brutal invention. Many parents were compelled to cooperate in addition to witnessing. Torchbearers in processions and signatories to agreements allowing their spouses and daughters to serve. The Senate was under pressure to enact legislation that provided theological justification for abuse. One such regulation framed any relationship with the emperor as a kind of devotion, declaring the monarch's body sacrosanct. The emperor's transgressions were sanctified by the legal superstructure. Caligula found coercive cooperation, a brutality that went beyond physical force. He wasn't limited to attacking families from the outside. He made them tools for their own demise. One example is Senator Cornelius. He stood up before the Senate and refused to turn over his wife, Libya. It was a daring but deadly public act of rebellion. The next morning, Cornelius's 8-year-old son was found alive, disfigured, and with a clear message etched into his body on the Senate steps. The alert was effective. Cornelius brought Libya to the emperor that afternoon. When she became pregnant by imperial edict some months later, Cornelius was compelled to acknowledge her as the rightful heir and give up all rights to his previous children. The statute was changed to include humiliation. The Senate unanimously decided that boys born into legal marriages were inferior to any child of the emperor, regardless of provenance. An administration equal to Rome's civil government was needed to run this infrastructure. Underneath the Palatine, secret clerks maintained careful records in a closed archive. Every file adhered to a template. The victim's name, age, social status, physical characteristics, acts committed, length of time, level of apparent cooperation, pregnancies that resulted, fees paid, doctors who examined the women, records of illness or injury, midwives present at forced births, guards who escorted them on predetermined schedules, and accountants who totaled earnings. Indeed, the emperor levied fees for these services, and the money received went into the imperial treasury. This machine turned hundreds of individuals into cogs. There were guards who upheld the timetables, accountants who balanced the budgets, scribes who produced the lists, official midwives, prosecutors of propriety, and custodians of ceremonial attire. People found it simpler to escape moral ownership as a result of the division of responsibilities. No one was the monster by himself. They might all say they were only playing a part. Some evenings were ritualized as spectacles. The best times were during full moons. Caligula transformed a private amphitheater into a staged pagan temple where he performed lunar fertility rites. He set up matchups with carefully chosen players. Gladiators are renowned for their strength. Animals were sometimes carried from the empire's boundaries by Nubian prisoners. Animals such as Maloyan mastiffs, trained bears, and a leopard that was once given as a royal gift. In their senatorial toggers, husbands sat in the galleries, forced to remain calm as their spouses were treated with contempt, using a golden bat adorned with phallic symbols to signify his decisions. The emperor planned every aspect like a ringmaster, choosing pairings, numbers, length, and even body placement. Names, events, timings, and particularly performative incidents were all recorded by scribes. Instead of anarchy, what transpired was a theater of power, a place where human agony was transformed into spectacle, and then turned into a commodity. The necessities of the palace gave rise to a whole shadow economy, Pain-relieving ointments and eye washes were offered by vendors. Abortions were provided by covert apothecaries. Young survivors learned how to imitate cooperation from tutors. Physicians started repair and reconstruction-focused practices. There was a cost for each person who interacted with the system. Everyone who came into contact with it made money, and the reason it lasted so long was because of that profit. Complicity was oiled by greed. Ambition, fear, and vanity all served as motivators to turn away, comply, and take part. Caligula's capacity for horrors was not the only horrifying thing. He created a culture in which atrocities were rewarded. Rome as a whole got involved in the crime. Luxury goods vendors were well aware of the source of senatorial families' unexpected wealth. Revenue was linked to compensation for participation in quiet. For couplings that everyone knew had been coerced, priests bestowed blessings. Poets wrote flowery poetry that transformed state-approved atrocities into legendary splendors. What the human bodies in the palace endured was never documented in the official histories. However, those corpses had their own tales to tell. Like a personal alphabet of suffering, scars developed. Pregnancies caused bellies to enlarge. Women attempted to conceal themselves behind layers of clothing. People stopped grinning. Years of inactivity caused the joyful facial muscles to atrophy. A senator's daughter named Valeria became completely mute after months of mistreatment. Her voice cords functioned, according to doctors. She was not incapable of speaking. She had just run out of words to express what she had gone through. Her silence had a contagious effect on the other victims. They refused to look into her eyes because they saw a mirror of their impending doom. Caligula developed ritualized cruelties as a result of his obsessions. While recounting the incident as if reciting poetry, he took twisted pleasure in forcing mothers to see the harm done to their daughters, and then switching positions to push mothers into the identical atrocities perpetrated on their children. This was not arbitrary cruelty. The doctrine was distorted. He felt he was undermining the moral underpinnings that had kept Rome together by eliminating parental honor, maternal love, and youthful innocence. He thought he was only bringing the ancient myths up to date. Gods that mistreated mankind were relics that justified their actions. Zeus pretended to be a beast. The same savagery became bureaucratic under Caligula. Desperate attempts at resistance were almost invariably deadly. Before they could be apprehended, several ladies grabbed poison from the royal gardens or other locations and ingested it. In an attempt to make themselves worthless to the system, some burned their faces or maimed themselves with knives. However, imperial doctors were adept at reviving both look and vitality. In order to discourage others, several suicides were reversed and brought back to the spotlight, often with additional public humiliations as punishment. They also did not spare those who were judged spoiled by mutilation. Caligula said that ugliness made the rite more pure, and that beauty had no bearing on heavenly service. He sometimes included deformed victims in the display. In other words, there was no real way out. Informants pursued anyone who attempted to escape, and the imperial secret police pulled them back for immediate retaliation, which often included their whole family. Entries flooded the imperial archive. Thousands and thousands of records, each with more information than the previous. There were codes, categories, and subcategories for each infraction. Forms had to be completed, procedures had to be adhered to, and hierarchy had to be respected. Atrocity accounting became as meticulous as tax and census ledgers. The ledger itself was sometimes shown by Caligula as a tool of intimidation. In order to make fathers and husbands listen to the clinical accounts of what had been done to their wives and daughters, he would read out selections in the Senate, choosing names and entries at random. Entry 346. Julia, Marcus Antonius's wife. 6 volunteers, 4 hours, and pregnancy verified. The punishment included public humiliation. In order to ensure that Rome would never forget what absolute power might do, the emperor was fostering a communal memory of the horror. The emperor's top defenders, the Taurian Guard, were not spectators. They were ingrained in the system, and after imperial usage, they were often rewarded with victims. They became cooperative administrators of the emperor's will by taking part in the ceremonies and watching over the hallways. Cassius Chaerea, a seasoned soldier who had been made fun of and humiliated by Caligula, was one such individual. At first, the ridicule was small-minded, with comments directed at his voice and instructions to carry out humiliating activities. However, the torment continued, until something in Chaerea broke. It was anger at his own debasement rather than an awakening of compassion. A last cruel ceremony was held on the evening of January 24, 41 CE. One Caligula was meant to be the pinnacle of his public pageants. In a tournament akin to an auction, senators' wives faced off against gladiators. Like cattle, numbers cried out. 20, 30, and 40 bodies moved like worn-out, submissive automatons. It was the last show. Chaerea and other Taurian conspirators surprised Caligula the next day as he was making his way into the theater via an underground tunnel. In a symbolic reversal of the emperor's humiliations, they repeatedly stabbed him, causing dozens of wounds, including a purposeful blow to the genitalia. It was a horrible irony. The guy at the heart of the system was killed by the same persons who had made it possible. Soon after, Melonia Caesonia, Caligula's wife, was killed. Julia Drusilla, his small daughter who was no older than a kid, was also murdered. The conspirators wanted to completely destroy the dynasty. However, the devastation persisted long after the emperor left. Blades could not destroy the records, the pregnancies, the scars, or the memories. Claudius, the new emperor, proclaimed a damnatio memoriale. Statues were overturned. They chipped away the inscriptions. Melted down were coins depicting Caligula. Paper and people recalled, but official remembrance was suppressed. The offspring of the breeding scheme were raised in ignorance of their ancestry. Victims grew old with secrets inside of them. It was impossible for fathers to face their daughters in the eye after holding torches at state rituals. It was not the system Caligula had created that was eliminated by his death, but a man. The afterlife of institutions is lengthy. The guide to institutionalized cruelty. The legal precedents, the authority, and the registries did not disappear along with his body. It could be revised, reprinted, or modified. New generations discovered that certain atrocities endure beyond their creators, transferring from one set of administrators to another like an infectious legacy, in the absence of protective families and laws to safeguard the weak. Ultimately, the most damning testimony was the echo of that night. The same hands who carried candles for the rites now celebrated a murderous deed. On the outside, the empire progressed, but on the inside, the scars persisted. The men who rationalized their participation, the women who carried their secrets into old age, and the children who were scarred by the program all contributed to a long and sinister legacy. Caligula had done more than just delight in immorality. He had developed the guidelines for transforming atrocities into government. Additionally, once written guides are never completely lost.